Economic responsibility. To help believers become dynamic witnesses in this world, we must encourage them to practice a biblical work ethic. Here's Gene to explain.
We don't know exactly what the issues were, but it certainly relates to a work ethic that impacts the world, either in a positive or a negative way. And so he wrote, about brotherly love, you don't need me to write you because you yourselves are taught by God to love one another. He's very positive. He commends them for that. In fact, you are doing this towards all the brothers in the entire region of Macedonia, which means that they must have been reaching out even as far as Berea and to the Philippians. And the Philippians, by the way, would have been about not quite 100 miles, I think, away, but well, it wouldn't be that big, about half that distance. So there could have been relationships there, but they were reaching out to the brothers in Macedonia. But we encourage you, brothers, to do so even more, to seek to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business, and to work with your own hands. Now, what were they doing or not doing? Some believe that they took so seriously the coming of Jesus Christ, and they believed in that, and Paul taught them that they just said, well, why in the world do we have to work? Let's just wait it out. Let's wait for the Lord to take us home and get us out of this mess. Well, that's possible. But in the meantime, they weren't living quiet lives. They were busybodies, evidently, getting into other people's affairs. They weren't minding their own businesses. They were not working with their own hands. And so Paul had to deal with this issue, and he says, as we commanded you, you should do this. And here's the reason, so that you may walk, here's one reason, so that you may walk properly in the presence of outsiders. In other words, it's not a good witness to unbelievers for us not to be diligent and to work hard and have a good, solid work ethic, because this in itself is a reflection of Christianity. And the other issue was and not be dependent on anyone. In other words, they evidently were being lazy and taking advantage of other people and using theological reasons to justify their behavior. You have to remember now that these people were converted out of paganism. They had very little background in terms of understanding Christianity. So Paul gets very practical here, and he deals with this issue. He dealt with this in other situations. For example, the churches in Asia, when he wrote the Ephesians, which was a circular letter, no doubt, to the other churches in Asia. He says the thief must no longer steal, which means that some of them were thieves before they came to Christ. Instead, he must do honest work with his own hands. And perhaps some of the Thessalonians were facing some of the same problems. He must do honest work with his own hands so that he has something to share with anyone in need. In other words, rather than taking advantage of other people, you need to be making a living, but making even more than a living, so you have something to share with other people that are really in need and need to be helped. So Paul was dealing with some very, very practical issues here in terms of the Thessalonians. And so when Timothy came back and reported and said, Paul, they're doing great, but they got a pocket of difficulty. They've got some believers that need instructions in terms of their work ethic. And so Paul addresses that. The question for reflection and response is, how can we teach Christians to be responsible economically and yet not become materialistic? I think we have probably another problem in our culture. In fact, that was a question that came up in my ministry in Singapore. There were a lot of people that actually raised that issue because the Singaporean culture tends to be a very materialistic culture. A very hard-working group of people, but very materialistic. And so as Christians, as pastors, they're trying to deal with that issue. And for those of you who live in Singapore, if that's inaccurate, let me know and I'll correct it. But I know some of your pastors are very concerned about the fact that it is a very materialistic culture. And we can say the same thing about our culture here in the United States. So how can we teach Christians to be responsible economically and yet not become materialistic? Well, I think there's a bottom line answer to that, and that is to always put God first in terms of our material things. If God is not first, we're going to move in the direction of being materialistic. There's no question about it. Because in essence what happens, the more we make, the more we want to keep for ourselves. That's the basic trend in our culture. I think that's the basic trend. It has been the basic trend throughout history. The more we make, the more we have, the more we want to keep for ourselves. The biblical way is the more we make, the more we have, the more we give, proportionally. And I think that that's the biblical concept. In other words, obviously, if we're giving 10%, which I think that should be a minimum for believers, as our income increases, obviously the 10% increases. But the Bible says the more we make, the more we give beyond the 10%, and that's what it means to give proportionally. And so consequently, we just need to get back to basic biblical principles and put God first as far as our lives are concerned. Otherwise, we will move in the direction of being materialistic. And so God speaks through Paul to that very specifically.